The anniversary had been planned down to the final candle. The private dinner, the handwritten tribute, and the carefully timed palace photograph were all ready. Then King Charles received a sealed legal file that changed everything. Within an hour, the celebration was cancelled, the guests were dismissed, and Camilla was left waiting for a husband who refused to enter the room. This was not a scheduling problem. It was a personal judgment, delivered without warning. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Buckingham Palace staff had prepared an intimate celebration inside a private royal residence, hoping the evening would calm months of tension. Camilla approved the flowers, chose music tied to their marriage, and arranged a quiet toast for Charles. The Queen believed the anniversary would prove their bond remained strong, but that message collapsed before any guest raised a glass. Charles sat alone when the family court ruling reached his study. A family court ruling is a judge's formal decision in a private legal dispute, and this one exposed an arrangement lacking his written approval. The king discovered that Camilla had supported plans securing royal-funded protection and residential privileges for her family. Those promises had been presented as carrying royal authority, though the monarch had never agreed. The page changed his expression. Charles removed his glasses, placed the file down, and said nothing. The silence around him felt absolute. The ruling accused the Queen of no crime, yet private correspondence showed discussions conducted in his name. Trust, not law, had become the real charge. Camilla heard the cancellation from an equerry, a senior royal aide who handles personal duties. She asked whether Charles was ill. The aide lowered his voice and replied only that the king had made a final decision. Her shock hardened into humiliation, because her husband had sent a messenger rather than facing her. Charles ordered the anniversary photograph removed from the palace schedule, and told his private secretary to retrieve every briefing connected to the arrangement. One sentence held him still. It suggested that the disputed protections had already been described to others as settled. Before Camilla could reach him, Charles summoned William. The prince entered knowing his answer could divide the family, because his father asked one question: had he heard about those promises before tonight? The anniversary had vanished in a single command, but the true damage would not be measured by an empty dining room. It would be revealed in the faces of the people now forced to choose between a king, a queen, and a family secret neither could contain. Charles and Camilla had survived public rejection, private sacrifice, and decades of scrutiny. Their marriage was supposed to be the ending of that struggle, the moment when endurance finally became acceptance. Yet on the night meant to honor their union, Charles treated her not as his closest companion, but as someone whose loyalty required examination. For Camilla, the cancelled dinner was humiliating. For Charles, celebrating while doubt remained would have felt like surrendering the crown to deception. Camilla remained at the prepared table while attendants removed the place settings. She touched the anniversary card meant for Charles, then pulled away. The queen consort had endured criticism because she believed their marriage had earned peace. Now the silence suggested that the trust beneath that peace had fractured. Charles stayed inside his study, carrying more than wounded pride. As sovereign, the reigning monarch responsible for protecting the institution, he could not ignore promises made with royal influence. The king had always believed Camilla understood the difference between personal kindness and public authority. That mattered because their marriage had survived when public approval seemed impossible. William entered cautiously and found his father beside a cold fireplace. The prince felt anger at being drawn into the dispute, yet he knew any misuse of royal influence could become his responsibility to repair. Charles asked whether he had heard discussions about accommodation and security for Camilla's relatives. William chose his words carefully. He admitted that vague references had reached him through household conversations, but he assumed Charles knew. The future king saw his father's expression change. His answer meant the promises had traveled beyond one room and begun resembling settled royal policy. Camilla feared something deeper than a cancelled celebration. She believed Charles now saw their marriage as a pathway she had used to secure protection for her family. Her children belonged to her private life, but royal resources were controlled through constitutional procedures, formal rules limiting how the monarchy may use public authority and household funds. She knew she had crossed close to that boundary. Charles then asked whether Catherine had heard the same claims. William hesitated. The prince admitted that his wife had once mentioned hearing talk of future residential guarantees, although she had dismissed it as unfinished planning. Catherine's name made the problem larger. The next generation had already been touched by it. Camilla rose from the table and called for an aide. She told him to inform Charles that she would remain awake until he agreed to face her. The legal file had exposed a question of authority, but the approaching confrontation would expose something far more dangerous. The moment when a wife's private loyalties collided directly with a husband's sacred oath. The court ruling did not create the crisis. It merely opened a door that had been locked for months. Behind it stood one private conversation at Balmoral, one promise made without witnesses, and one assumption that royal approval could be secured later. At the time, Camilla viewed the exchange as an act of reassurance toward her family. Charles would eventually see it differently. To him, that evening became the instant affection crossed an invisible boundary and entered the territory of royal power. Months earlier, Camilla had begun worrying about what would happen when the monarchy passed to William. Balmoral, the royal family's private Scottish estate, had always offered space for intimate conversations beyond the formality of palace life. The Queen feared that her relatives could suddenly lose protection, access, and any place near the institution once Charles was no longer there to defend them. Charles had tried to calm her. The king promised that no one would be treated cruelly, yet he refused to create permanent guarantees that might restrict William later. The prince would one day control many household decisions, and the monarch believed no private promise should bind his son before that future arrived. Camilla carried that fear into a private Balmoral gathering. After dinner, she met one of her adult children alone and said that long-term security support, along with continued use of a residence near royal property, had been settled at the highest level. Her relative asked whether Charles had personally approved it. She paused, then answered that the king understood what she required. The Queen did not believe she was betraying him. She saw herself protecting family members who had faced years of unwanted attention because of her marriage. Yet compassion had blurred into authority. Charles's private sympathy was not institutional authorization, meaning formal permission granted through the monarchy's official process. A documented account of that conversation later entered a confidential family settlement dispute. When the court examined who would fund the promised support, palace correspondence was requested. No signed approval appeared. Instead, messages showed Camilla's office pressing staff to prepare options while describing Charles as supportive, even though he had postponed every final decision. Charles returned to the passage and underlined the words "settled at the highest level." He summoned the aide who had attended the gathering and asked, "Did she use my name?" The aide hesitated, then confirmed she had used it deliberately that night. That answer turned hurt into controlled fury. Balmoral had been remembered as a quiet family evening, but it now carried the weight of a broken boundary. And when Charles finally opened Camilla's door, neither of them could pretend the issue was merely legal. Charles entered without an aide, without a prepared statement, and without the warmth Camilla had expected on their anniversary. She rose to meet him, but he did not approach her. Instead, he placed the court file between them and asked why his name had been used to support a promise he had never approved. In that instant, years of shared survival disappeared. There was only a husband demanding honesty, and a wife realizing that explanation might no longer be enough. Camilla had spent hours preparing her defense. She meant to explain that discussions had been preliminary and centered on family safety rather than personal gain. The Queen Consort believed her intentions mattered, but Charles entered carrying the sealed ruling, closed the door himself, and made certain no courtier, an advisor serving the royal household, could soften the exchange. Charles placed the file on the table and repeated the Balmoral assurance word for word. The king asked whether she had knowingly allowed her family to believe that the crown had guaranteed their future protection. The crown meant the monarch's authority, not private wishes. That distinction now stood between them like a verdict. Camilla admitted using language stronger than the power she held. She insisted that earlier conversations with Charles had convinced her he would eventually approve a humane arrangement. The Queen said she had not tried to seize control. She had tried to prevent people she loved from being abandoned when his reign ended. Charles did not accept that answer. He told her that understanding fear was not permission, and sympathy was not consent. The monarch accused her of turning marital confidence into presumed royal approval. Camilla reached for the file, but he placed one hand over it and stopped her. The gesture carried more force than shouting. Camilla exposed the fear beneath her decision. She said William's future household intended to remove every privilege connected to her relatives once Charles was gone. The Queen had heard the warning through a private exchange involving a senior member of the prince's staff. a conversation later described to her in a documented account by one of her aides. Charles demanded the name. Camilla gave it, and the king's anger shifted. Someone inside William's circle had been feeding anxiety into the marriage while presenting the future king as merciless. Charles said nothing more. He opened the door, left her alone, and ordered William's private secretary to attend a meeting at first light. Camilla had finally admitted what she had done, but her explanation pointed beyond her own family and toward a deeper struggle over who would control the monarchy after Charles, and who had been quietly preparing for that future already. By morning, the crisis was no longer confined to a wounded marriage. It had reached the machinery of succession. Charles wanted to know whether William's household had created the fear that pushed Camilla into making promises. William wanted to know why his future authority had been used to justify private arrangements he had never seen. Between father and son stood a dangerous possibility. Someone had been telling both sides that the other intended to act without mercy. William paused outside the study and adjusted his cuffs again. Catherine noticed the nervous habit and told him quietly to enter as a son before speaking as an heir. The prince understood why her advice mattered. Charles held constitutional authority, meaning the lawful power exercised by the reigning monarch, while William represented the future control of royal residences, household structures, and priorities. Charles waited across a narrow table with the private secretary beside him. The king pushed forward a memorandum describing a future review of non-core family provisions. Those words referred to support given to relatives outside the direct working monarchy. Camilla had influence because she stood beside the sovereign, but she held no independent power to guarantee permanent crown-funded privileges. William read the line twice. The future king denied ordering threats against Camilla's relatives, and explained that routine planning had been twisted into a campaign of removal. He felt furious that cold administrative language had been carried into a marriage and reshaped as proof of cruelty. Charles listened, but his suspicion did not ease. The private secretary then identified the staff member behind the remark. He explained through a documented internal account that the advisor had once worked in an office connected to Camilla before transferring into William's wider administrative network. The same person had access to both households and understood exactly which fears would wound each side. Charles felt the argument changing beneath him. Camilla may have reacted to a genuine phrase, yet someone had stripped it of context and delivered it as a warning. The king still believed she had crossed a line, but he now saw that her panic had been deliberately fed by a person presenting themselves as a trusted intermediary. William demanded a full review. The prince wanted every conversation traced before his future authority became a weapon again. Charles agreed, then froze every proposed family arrangement linked to Camilla until the inquiry ended. Neither man spoke afterward, because both understood the next order would strike the queen with force. The king had found evidence that fear had been deliberately fed, but uncovering manipulation did not erase Camilla's decision. And by noon, the safeguards Charles imposed would make her isolation impossible to hide. The first punishment did not arrive through a public statement. It came quietly, in altered schedules, withdrawn access, and unanswered requests. Camilla remained queen, but the private authority she had exercised with confidence was suddenly suspended. Staff who once acted on her preferences now waited for written confirmation from the king's office. For the first time since Charles ascended the throne, she felt the palace treating her not as his partner, but as a risk that had to be contained. Camilla entered the briefing room, expecting the usual folder beside her chair. The table was bare. When she asked where it had gone, an aide explained that every financial, residential, and security proposal involving her relatives now required clearance from Charles's office. Written authorization from the sovereign's private secretary meant formal approval from the senior official who manages the monarch's most sensitive business. Camilla dismissed the staff without raising her voice. She remained alone, staring at the empty space where the folder should have been. Meetings had already been postponed, files redirected, and requests left unanswered. The queen understood the message. Her title remained, but the discretion she once exercised had vanished. Even loyal aides now watched their language around her, afraid that ordinary kindness might be mistaken for unauthorized royal consent. Charles felt the cost as well. The king passed the anniversary flowers, while attendants carried them away and stopped for a moment. He did not reverse the order. The discarded celebration reminded him that discipline was cutting through the marriage he had fought decades to protect. The internal review soon uncovered draft proposals that had never reached him. Notes from Camilla's office urged staff to describe new benefits as continuity measures, meaning existing support preserved rather than fresh privileges created. One draft even referenced a future understanding with William's household. William denied any agreement in a recorded meeting with Charles and the review team. The prince insisted that someone had exaggerated support from both royal camps. His denial pointed again toward the intermediary, who had carried selective warnings between the households. Charles removed that advisor from active duties pending investigation. Camilla saw the suspension as proof that she had been misled, yet the monarch refused to restore her authority. He needed to understand why she had accepted those assurances without demanding written confirmation. That evening, Camilla wrote to him by hand. She requested one private meeting, not as queen and king, but as husband and wife. The machinery of the palace had delivered its judgment, yet the future of the marriage would be decided away from files and advisors, in a room where Charles and Camilla could no longer hide behind the crown. When Charles agreed to meet her, Camilla entered without papers, advisors, or prepared arguments. She carried only the anniversary card she had never given him. The anger between them had not disappeared, but exhaustion had stripped away the language of offices and titles. For the first time since the court file arrived, she did not defend the promises or blame the people who had encouraged her. She admitted the fear beneath them, and that confession changed what Charles believed the crisis was truly about. Charles chose a modest sitting room away from the main palace offices. He wanted no desk, no staff, and no symbol of rank between them. The king understood that official rooms belonged to the institution, while this conversation belonged to a husband and wife, deciding whether trust could survive what authority had exposed. Camilla placed the unopened anniversary card on the table. The queen told him she no longer expected the cancelled evening to be restored. She only wanted Charles to understand why she had acted before he decided what their marriage would become. Camilla then admitted the fear she had hidden for months. She believed that after Charles died, her family might be treated as an embarrassment attached to a closed chapter of royal history. The assurances at Balmoral had grown from panic over losing him, and the limited protection his presence gave those closest to her. Charles listened without interrupting. The monarch told her that fear did not justify using his name, yet his voice softened. He finally understood that she had been preparing for a future without him, while he had avoided that future, because discussing succession forced him to confront his own mortality. Camilla slid the card toward him. Charles did not open it. Instead, the king covered her hand with his and said trust could not return through pretending the cancellation had never happened. Camilla accepted responsibility without qualification. She agreed that every family arrangement should face independent review and offered to withdraw from all discussions involving her relatives. The queen no longer asked to be excused. She asked only for a fair boundary. Charles revealed through the internal review's documented findings that the intermediary had manipulated both households. He still made clear that another person's deception did not erase Camilla's choice to speak beyond her authority. Charles proposed that she retain her constitutional and ceremonial role, meaning her official duties beside the sovereign, while an independent household committee managed private family provisions. They had found a path back toward one another, but reconciliation in private could not prevent judgment in public, and by sunrise, their empty anniversary table had become a symbol claimed by an entire nation. The palace released no photograph, offered no anniversary message, and gave no explanation for the silence. That absence became louder than any statement. Broadcasters interrupted their schedules, newspapers rebuilt their front pages, and crowds gathered outside royal gates searching for meaning. The public did not know every detail contained in the family court ruling, but it understood the symbolism immediately. A king had refused to celebrate his marriage on the very night designed to prove that the union remained unbreakable. Palace officials called the cancelled anniversary a private matter. The explanation only deepened suspicion because Charles and Camilla had been expected to release a new portrait marking the occasion. Royal correspondents, journalists who report on the monarchy, linked the silence to the disclosed family court proceedings and asked whether the king had chosen duty over his wife. One newspaper answered with brutal simplicity. Its front page showed the palace gates beneath the headline, "The Dinner That Never Happened." A smaller photograph captured anniversary flowers being carried through a service entrance. The image spread because it turned a hidden marital crisis into something the public could understand. Celebration had been prepared, then deliberately removed. A veteran commentator sharpened the debate during an evening broadcast. Speaking in a recorded television discussion, she said, "The king has protected the crown, but he may have wounded the marriage that cost him more than any other." Her words divided viewers between those who praised royal accountability and those who saw Camilla's treatment as cruel. Camilla watched alone. The queen muted the television when the abandoned flowers appeared and turned the anniversary card face down. An aide offered to stay, but she refused. The woman who had once endured public hostility now faced a different pain: silence from the husband, whose acceptance had made every sacrifice bearable. Charles listened to a communications briefing without interruption. An advisor suggested releasing a photograph of the couple to calm speculation, but the king rejected it. A staged display would misrepresent the fragile understanding reached in private and reduce pain to palace management. The palace later confirmed an internal administrative review, meaning an official examination of household decisions, while refusing to discuss confidential court material. Crowds gathered near Buckingham Palace carrying messages for both sides. Some supported Charles for defending public trust. Others argued that Camilla had suffered a punishment too visible for a private mistake. Charles finally decided silence could carry no more weight. The public had turned one absent celebration into a national verdict, but only he could deliver the judgment that mattered, and his final choice would reveal whether the anniversary marked the destruction of a marriage or the painful remaking of it. Charles did not restore the cancelled dinner. He did not replace it with a photograph, a delayed toast, or a carefully staged display of affection. The anniversary remained empty, because he believed erasing the consequence would erase the lesson. Yet he also refused to let one grave failure define the entire marriage. His final decision separated love from authority, protected the monarchy from private promises, and forced both husband and wife to accept that survival together required more than loyalty. It required limits. Charles approved a formal review process for every security provision, residence, or royal resource connected to Camilla's relatives. The process meant each request would be examined through written records and independent approval. Neither the queen nor her private office could control those decisions again. The king had drawn a permanent line between personal compassion and institutional commitment. Camilla kept her public duties and her place beside him. Charles concluded that fear, poor judgment, and overreach had shaped her actions, not a deliberate wish to damage the crown. The crown, meaning the authority and responsibilities of the monarchy, had been protected without turning forgiveness into denial. Camilla apologized privately to Charles and William. She admitted that her words had suggested royal approval where none existed. The Queen accepted that closeness to the sovereign could never replace written authorization. William accepted her apology, but the prince insisted that every future arrangement be documented, reviewed, and transparent. The investigation removed the intermediary from royal service permanently. A documented final report showed that selective warnings had fed mistrust between both households. Yet Charles refused to let manipulation erase personal responsibility. The king knew each person still owned the choices made after hearing those warnings. Several days later, Charles sat with Camilla at breakfast without staff nearby. She watched as he finally opened the anniversary card. The monarch read every line, folded it carefully, and placed it inside his jacket. He did not promise that everything would return to what it had been. She did not ask him to. Camilla understood that forgiveness came with limits. Charles understood that silence about death, succession, and her future had allowed fear to grow. Their marriage survived, but the illusion surrounding it did not survive with them anymore. The empty table had first appeared to represent rejection. In the end, it represented the price of truth. Charles chose the crown without abandoning Camilla. Camilla accepted love without borrowed authority, and the monarchy emerged not untouched, but unmistakably steadier, because its most private conflict had finally been faced. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.